I was mute, so all the things that I said, nobody. I was just talking about the presentation and stuff like that. Nothing very important. If you have any questions about the presentations, just put it in the chat. Put it in Campus Fire, I can answer. All right, so let's go, guys.
Hi everyone. My name is Rainy. We have Lee, Nat, and Cindy's going to be joining me joining us on video, and we're here to present the paper titled Ghost Talk: EMI Attacks on Analog Sensors. So starting with the problem statement, we have first the premise that all circuits are affected by electromagnetic interference through backdoor coupling. EMI can be categorized by power and intentionality, and of those four categories, low power intentional signals are the least researched and most vulnerable, especially on analog sensors. In terms of devices studied in the paper, there are cardiac medical devices, so ECG stands for electrocardiogram external machines, and CIED are cardiac implantable electrical devices. They also researched the effect of EMI on microphones and commodity devices. The vulnerability that they found was that signal injections can cause incorrect readings, leading to incorrect reactions. Within the context of this class, we believe that this falls into the category of integrity or fault attacks under the subcategory of general contamination. So in particular, it means that pacemakers can be sending shocks at the wrong time after having been tampered with, and that microphones might be making speech unintelligible or incorrect.
We'll talk about two types of low-power EMI attacks. First, let's consider cardiac medical sensors like ECG or defibrillator. Typically, these have a set of low-pass filters that filter out high-frequency signals. And the output of the signals after the low-pass filters have what we call the baseband frequency. So if we want to inject a malicious signal to survive the low-pass filters, they have to be in the baseband frequency. Next, let's consider a microphone sensor. Because there's usually no low-pass filters in commodity microphone devices, the injected signal can have a high frequency with more success. So the two types of EMI attacks we'll talk about are baseband EMI attacks and amplitude modulated EMI attacks. The paper tried injecting signals with high amplitude that are in the baseband frequency into three different cardiac medical devices: the ECG, pacemaker, and defibrillator. With the ECG, they successfully injected signals that dominated the peaks in the sensor readings. With pacemaker and defibrillator, they saw success in sending signals over free air, but found it much more difficult to inject signals when the sensor leads were submerged in saline. And again, they also confirmed the hypothesis that high-frequency signals don't really work on medical devices because of the low-pass filters. Devices like microphones are more subject to high-frequency attacks because of the lack of low-pass filters. The entry point of attack identified by the paper was the conducting path between the microphone and the amplifier. The injected signal would be an amplitude modulated signal. The amplitude here is M of t, which has the baseband frequency, and the carrier frequency would closely match the resonant frequency of the sensor circuit. The theory is that this modulated signal would dominate the original audio signal from the microphone. So the paper did an experiment that verified this theory. They used an audio tone at 430 Hertz as the original signal, and the EMI signal had a frequency of 550 Hertz, which is close to the baseband frequency, and then modulated with a carrier frequency of 826 megahertz. The results showed that after increasing the transmission power to a high enough point, the injected signal would dominate the legitimate signal. They also performed an experiment of using EMI signals to transmit intelligible speech. The setup included a MacBook speaker that play the original audio, an EMI modulated signal as described, and a microphone sensor, which was a Bluetooth headset. The results, which was measured using the speech transmission index, showed that both a legitimate channel and the injected audio channel had a high comparable STI scores. In fact, the injected audio had an even higher STI score. Using the types of attacks outlined in the paper, there are a variety of real-world cases in which these attacks can be harmfully used, and the paper actually tried all of these out. For instance, attackers can use EMI signals to initiate virtual button presses while on a phone session, or they can use injected signals to completely block out the original conversation in a Skype call, or they can even inject new audio and make the original audio appear as background noise while the fake audio comes across clearly in a phone call. We'll talk about two types of low-power EMI attacks. First,
so to address the attacks that Cindy was explaining, the researchers came up with a few analog defenses, but these basically only achieve mitigation, not elimination. These are already used to some extent in CIDs, but not in commodity electronics. The first method that they described is shielding. So that's coating a webcam with a conducting surface. And they found that even though there were large holes still left in the model because of the buttons and the lenses, it still made the attack more difficult by requiring 10,000 times more power. The second method that they tried to use was using differential comparators. That means keeping a reference waveform and removing the common node interference from consideration. This had the same effect of requiring more power to achieve the same range and efficacy. The last one is using filters that would be attenuating signals outside the sensor's baseband frequency to reduce the vulnerable frequency range of that sensor. This is something that's already implemented in the medical devices, but could also be used for commodities.
Now, as for adding defenses on the digital side of a sensor, we have this strategy that could be applicable to all sensors. And the idea is to add an additional component that doesn't measure what you want to measure, like for the sensor, but measures the general environment. And then we could calculate something called a contamination level, which the math is on the upper right, but it's the root mean squared of the waveform that you're seeing in the environment, divided by the root mean squared of the same components, but when it's calibrated in a quiet environment. And then once you get the value, it's just like a number. So you could get like 2.1 and you can decide, okay, this is too contaminated. And then you could activate a adaptive noise canceling filter. I'm not an EE person, so maybe y'all have heard of this before, but I haven't. So basically you have the reference signal, which is your environment signal, and the sensor's measured signal, and it'll estimate the noise that it's seeing and maybe also estimate the attacks, and then subtract that out and get the clean signal. As for specifically to the pacemakers, they propose this novel contribution where you can detect if your pacemaker is receiving a bad signal using biological fact. And the biological fact is when your heart contracts, it can't contract again immediately after because of something called the absolute refractory period. It's just the period of time where, well, the ion channels haven't restored yet. Biology stuff. But the idea is, since a pacemaker is measuring the heart voltages, if you see a heartbeat and then their idea is send this pacing pulse to tell the heart, hey, can you contract again? And if you see like another heartbeat in that absolute refractory period, that means you have an untrustworthy pacemaker signal. What you should see is that after the pacing pulse, nothing is happening. And the resulting action is you could tell the user, hey, someone might be trying to kill you by making your pacemaker function incorrectly, and defaults to a safe programmed pacing output that's like coded by doctors, approved by doctors. The problem is they didn't really test this or like really in-depth evaluate like the medical safety of this strategy. So that would be a future work that they have to investigate.
Thanks, Lee. Who would have known that randomly shocking hearts is a medical issue? So this paper was published in 2013, and since then, a lot of movement has happened both on the academic and on the corporate side. Let's start with academic. So a big movement has been to formalize the sensor security model. What does this mean? What's the threat model? What actually is a transduction attack? I want to highlight the second paper that came out in 2020, which includes 3 of the original authors on this paper. They double back and really dig down to the details about what actually the entire threat model is. Now that we have a threat model, we can better detect these kinds of attacks. And I want to emphasize things both Renee and Lee said. So first, Lee talked about this very general signal detection thing where you look at a contamination metric and see how off or deviant your signal is. Zhang and Rasmussen in RAID 2022 expand upon this, providing various metrics, not only just the root mean square. In addition, there are specific context application ones that you can do. Lee talked a little bit about the heart. Another option for ultrasonic sensors is something that Lee et al. Differently proposed in 2019 in IEEE Access. Finally, once we know how to detect them, we can try to mitigate or prevent these attacks. There's a ton of stuff here. I'll just quickly highlight 4. Microphones have amplifiers, not an E major, but apparently that's true. And Fiore in 2016 has developed an EMI resilient signal amplifier. Rating talked about transduction shields. Those used to be more expensive to create, but in the CCS 2021 paper, 2 et al. Have developed a low complexity one. A cyber physical firewall is a much bigger, high-level idea of, hey, maybe we should not be trusting all the physical components in our system. That's, of course, an approach that we can take. And AT&T has actually filed 20 patents that cite this paper, though they haven't implemented any of it in like actual stuff. And so I think it's interesting to see that companies care too. But that leads me to, are companies actually doing any of this? And the answer is no. So why is that, right? Well, in the paper, they said that it's not really an urgent public health risk. Right now, in order to actually kill someone with this pacemaker, shock, it needs to be really, really close to them, so close that you're actually in their body, right? Not very realistic. But I think that this gives us a much better outlook from a bigger picture point of view. Medtronic hasn't responded to this paper. Their EMI guidelines still say, hey, if there's EMI, try turning it off and on again. That's it. Good luck. Have fun. But I also want to point out there's a lot of stuff that you can't do with a pacemaker that isn't adversarial. You can't be beside an arc welder or a powerful cell tower. And so I want to go to this bigger picture idea. The paper closes with this sentence: secure websites should follow the principle of not trusting unvalidated user input, and the analog, because it's on analog sensors, of this advice should resonate for sensor systems too. So what does that mean? Well, all the suggested defenses we talked about, from the analog stuff, shielding differential comparators and filters, to the digital contamination strategy, not only do they predict against malicious attacks, but they can also help against passive robustness issues when you're close to a large cell phone antenna, for example. And so going back to a core course theme, increasing the security robustness can help everyone, not just protecting against adversarial attacks. And this is, there's a lot of precedents for this, including communications, for example, where error correcting codes help prevent against leaky wires, but also adversaries. In addition, there's a lot of issues that are beyond technical. So we just need to take sensor security more seriously. If manufacturers supported bug bounty programs or hackathons, and the government factor this into, for example, a health insurance risk assessment, maybe we'd have more development in this field. So as we've mentioned many times, none of us are EE majors, so we know very little about this field. So we have some discussion questions for all of you. Is it true that there's a one-size-fits-all solution for adversarial and non-adversarial EMI? Or are there context-specific things, like for medical devices, which are small and you can't really rip a pacemaker out of someone? Or for a real-time system where latency is much more important than size? And finally, what are the non-technical things that we need to change for people to take EMI attacks more seriously? Anyways, thanks for listening to our presentation. We hope you enjoyed our cats, and if you have any questions, let us know.
All right. We should attack them to get it more seriously. All right. So any questions from the audience? People. That's
For the follow-up papers that were shown in 2013, was there any research into like somebody getting in at the supply chain time and affecting the traces between the analog sensor and the processing unit to look to see if there was any threats there?
Oh, that's a good question. To be honest, I don't think we looked into that. So supply chain attacks are things like later in the syllabus, right? So not course content. No, I think most of these attacks are after the fact, like only with public information about the system. What can you do with just like commodity electronics? So I guess you wouldn't even need a supply chain attack to do all of this stuff. But I'm sure that would also be bad.
All right, thank you.
any other questions? How many of you have found this paper interesting? How many read it and found it interesting? Yeah, this is kind of like similar in the realm of sensors attacks. We talked a little bit about, for example, dolphin attacks, and this is just another way of doing that. And I really like the fact that you are also looking into whether industries are actually using it. I was actually had a discussion with some other colleagues a few days back on, like, Amazon is actually trying to look into this for their stores, for their Whole Foods stores. And apparently for them, it seems to be the microphones are a big challenge. And it seems that shielding is like the #1 kind of like solutions for them. But beyond shielding, there could be some other things that still might make the system vulnerable. So it's really a question of at what point industries start to kind of adopting this kind of problems. But it seems that as more and more of these sensors are kind of be prevalent in various different places, then some low end and low cost attacks probably becomes more and more visible. So people start making more, becoming more serious about this. This guy Kevin Pu, actually, he was in the FDA, and he was working on security of medical devices. So he recently actually leave FDA, but they are actually very seriously thinking about for any medical device, they now need to go through a whole bunch of passes for FDA to get approval for cyber security aspects of things as well. So that's quite interesting about this. All right, any other questions? Great, that's a great benchmark for the presentation. This is what you would get the full points with. So if you want to kind of get an idea of like how to present, this could be a good one. All right. I really like it. Good job. Thanks. All right, who's next? Group 2? Yeah.
Thanks.
Yep. Don't forget that. Yeah. All right, I'm gonna pause. All right. Ready? Ready? All right. Yeah, when you're introducing yourself, also mention which year are you in, which are you CS, EC, things like that as well. Okay? All right. All right, guys, let's do the next one. Yeah, please.
All right, hi everyone, I'm Madison. I'm a first year master's student in the EE department.
Hi everyone, I'm Shiva. I'm a second year master's student EC department.
I'm David, first year EC master's student.
I'm David. I'm also a first year EC masters.
And today we'll be presenting on the paper titled Detecting Audio Deepfakes Through Vocal Tract Reconstruction. So first, a little bit about the main problem that the paper addresses. So audio deepfakes allow for the convincing impersonation of a targeted individual, which can negatively impact that person. And it's difficult to detect whether audio is organic or deepfake without prior knowledge of the deepfake generation algorithm. And tying this a little bit to what we learned in class, the paper uses a threat model similar to what we saw in class with an adversary, a defender, and a victim. And in this model, the adversary creates the deepfake of the victim, and we assume that they have access to enough victim-specific audio and computing power, and we assume that the defender has no access to any victim-specific audio and no knowledge of the deepfake generation algorithm. So now for some general background information. Deepfakes are made using generative adversarial networks, which are a form of unsupervised learning that use two neural networks, a generator and a discriminator. And the generator tries to fool the discriminator with artificially generated content, which indirectly trains the discriminator since they're working against each other. And this paper chooses to use a novel approach to deepfake detection by using articulatory phonetics in its method of deepfake detection. So we'll go ahead and provide a brief background on phonetics. So there are different types of phonemes, as you can see in the lower right-hand image over there. And each is dependent on the positioning of the vocal tract components and the way that air moves through them. And both phonemes and the transitions between phonemes encapsulate how we speak. And so the paper chose to break speech down into pairs of phonemes called bigrams. Now about how deepfake audio is generated. So deepfake audio generation algorithms are comprised of three stages: an encoder, a synthesizer, and a vocoder. The paper kind of treats deepfake audio generation as a black box process, so we won't go into more detail about these three, but if you're interested, it's all in the paper. But a key difference that's important to note is that deepfake audio, unlike organic audio, lacks anatomical constraints. And so there's a high probability of producing results with unnatural vocal tract diameters that aren't a biologically appropriate representation of speech. And finally, to wrap up this background section, we'll touch on how the paper performed vocal tract modeling. So the paper uses a concatenated tube model with the cross-sectional area of each tube assigned to characterize the speaker's vocal tract, as you can see in the upper right-hand corner. And there's lots of math in the paper that goes into more detail, but these equations below describe a two-tube system, which is a little bit simplified, but can be easily extrapolated to a system with more tubes.
Okay, so with all of the necessary background discussed, we can now go into the proposed solution presented by the paper, which is a deepfake audio detector. So this makes use of the vocal tract estimator and determines whether the audio is organic or deepfake. So it consists of two steps, the first of which is organic range extraction. So in this first step, the detector takes in known organic audio samples with corresponding metadata containing the words and phonemes along with respective timing information. And the metadata is then augmented to get bigrams from the audio sample with corresponding timing information. so that the corresponding audio segments for each bigram are retrieved from the sample for processing purposes. So next, each segment is windowed using a sliding window to accurately capture the vocal transitions within each bigram, as the deepfakes cannot necessarily accurately replicate every single transition. So these window segments are then passed in the vocal tract estimator, getting a result of cross-sectional areas. And distributions of cross-sectional areas for each bigram are then constructed from the feature vectors. So from here, the second step, whole sample detection can be performed. And with this step, the audio sample is pre-processed in the same manner as the metadata is augmented and used to extract bigram feature pairs for the audio sample using the vocal tract estimator. Only the bigram feature pairs existent from organic range extraction are evaluated, and the features are compared against the respective bigram distributions. And if a majority of such bigram feature pairs aren't within their distributions, then the audio sample is labeled as deepfake. So following the definition of the general deepfake audio detector, the paper proposes a way to optimize the detector using all of the bigram feature pairs and the organic range, as using all of them can be inefficient and it can be unnecessary. So instead, we could pick out specific pairs that can serve as the best discriminators for this purpose. And to optimize the metadata for audio samples, an association can be constructed between the vocal tract features and specific bigrams. And from there, a PDF can be plotted for each bigram feature pair. So the PDF curves between organic deepfake audio samples are then compared. And if they overlap, that means that the feature is not a good discriminator. If they don't overlap, however, then the pair would be seen as an ideal discriminator to be included inside of the ideal feature set. And as seen with the two examples here, the left one is a non-ideal discriminator, while the right one would be good for the ideal feature set, given the separation between the distributions for organic and deepfake audio. And additionally, based on the separation between the two distributions for ideal features, a threshold value would be selected that best divides the two distributions. And with the identification of the bigram features that act as strong discriminators, the optimized detector would then only analyze bigram feature pairs of an audio sample existent within the ideal feature set. And majority voting would be used to identify the number of times the bigram feature values from the test audio sample cross the defined respective threshold for, from the ideal feature set. And if a majority of them do, then the sample is classified as a deepfake.
So to test their model, the researchers needed both organic and deepfake audio. So for organic audio, they used the timid data set, which is a set of 630 English speakers speaking 10 sentences. And for deepfake audio, they used an open source online tool, which is public, and they generated basically one fake audio sample per timid speaker. So they sampled 300 speakers times 10 sentences each. So they generated about 3,000 samples. And they also time aligned each of these samples. So they got kind of time information of when the phonemes were actually being produced for each sample. Next up, to evaluate, they divided each sample into a feature extraction set, kind of like a training set, as well as an evaluation set. And to prove that their model would be useful in real life, where oftentimes you don't have that much training data and you're often looking at kind of previously unseen audio, they made it so that the speakers weren't repeated between sets and that the evaluation set was 5 times larger than the extraction set, which is kind of flipping the traditional machine learning paradigm where the training set is usually much, much larger. So to evaluate their model, they looked at 4 main criteria. So first, detective performance. After classifying all samples in the evaluation data set, kind of the opposite of the previous group, I'm not like a CS person, so I have to look up what these words meant. But they achieved 99.9% precision, 99.5% recall, and a 2.5% false positive rate. Next up was a feature set. Their ideal feature set, even though it didn't include the most common bigrams found in the audio, they were still able to create this PDF on the right side, and which is kind of their binary classification of real or fake. And so, as you can see, most of the classifications are closer to the extremes. That means that the model was very confident about most of the classifications that were produced. And basically, not many were on the border. Next up, for fundamental features, they did a PCA of the organic versus deepfake audio, and they found on the top right side
The deepfake is the one on the right side, and you can see there's a lot less variance within fake audio. And after performing physical modeling of the deepfake audio, on the bottom right, you can see figure C. The model vocal tracks of deepfake audio is about the size and shape of a drinking straw. So this kind of furthers their hypothesis that deepfake audio is inherently inhuman. Finally, for transferability, they used a private model, a private commercial deepfake generator called Lyrebird, with a few deepfakes from them. But actually, the original feature set wasn't able to detect these new deepfakes, and they actually had to retrain the model and extract a new ideal feature set to be able to identify them. And yeah.
Yeah, so this work was done very recently. It was talked about in Usenix Security Symposium just last year. But the researchers did go into limitations of their model and which could be improved. So one of those is the acoustic model that they're using, the concatenated tube model. It's very useful for vowel sounds, ah, e, I, o, u. But the problem with that, they state that that's not too much of an issue because 38% of phonemes that are found are vowels. And so it's likely that each word will have some form of vowel transition. The problem with that maybe is that you're ruling out possibilities of other languages that don't have that don't have the common vowel sounds. Another issue that they discuss is that they don't have much public access to deepfake algorithms. And even though they treat it like a black box, they obviously couldn't test it on too many. They only tested it on Lyrebird and their own deepfake audio. So they couldn't test it on anything else. They do discuss the fact of trying to lower the high false positive rates, but the reason they wanted to make it a little higher at 2.5%, which was not ideal for them, is that the assumption that they make is that labeling organic audio as a deepfake isn't as bad as labeling a deepfake audio as organic. And then kind of going to David's point about transferability between different models, they want to do a more efficient all bigram processing technique rather than using ideal feature sets. But again, that's time inefficient. So finding a way to make that efficient is important. So just kind of some final discussion points we noted. This work uses entirely pre-recorded and pre-processed audio. So does this pose kind of a limitation as to the use of this detection scheme in live scenarios like phone calls or Zoom calls? And based on the question above, did this team actually solve the protection issues posed by their security model? Furthermore, authors did acknowledge malicious use of false positives. So maybe someone tries to take back what they said by saying, oh, my audio was a deepfake, even though it wasn't. Is this assumption that false positives aren't that big of an issue compared to false negatives correct? And is 2.5% sufficiently low enough to negate this concern? And finally, they used Gentle and Google Speech API to perform their bigram labeling and metadata timestamping. Is it safe to assume that these services are not also compromisable? This paper does not discuss the issues of that in general, and can reliance on the accuracy of these tools lead to overall failure? So with that, that's kind of the end of our presentation. Are there any questions or responses to our discussion points?
How many of you have used deepfake? Yeah, question.
I just had a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, the way that this model detects deepfake audio is by vocal track reconstruction. So it uses like some fluid dynamics equations from whatever audio is provided to create that vocal track. And that's like comically not similar to what like is possible to be generated from a human. I was wondering if there's been any deepfake audio generators that start with like a very generic vocal track and then sort of like try to optimize that for a certain voice, and how this would hold up against that.
Yeah, so they did some research into trying to use machine learning models and model the vocal tract itself as well. What they did was they tried to lower the training error to almost zero, using known features about vocal tract modeling. And what they found is they could not get their loss value to even close to a non-zero to a close to zero value. And they couldn't even do it in a reasonable amount of time to get it to converge to even like 10% or something, like a loss value of 10 or something. So the reasoning, they say, oh, it's unlikely that an adversary could beat the system is because it's just so hard to actually model those vocal tracks.
Yeah, great job with the presentation. Love the mutes. Something I'm curious about is if an adversary then has access to this model, I assume they could just use it as a discriminator in their GAN, which would maybe destroy the entire purpose of the model. Do you know if the authors looked into that at all? Was that kind of just a future work thing? And that was pretty recent.
Yeah, that was kind of, I think that's kind of goes back to the point that we just made, that they did basically have a whole section about, oh, what if this algorithm is like public knowledge?
Oh,
And it was using those vocal tracks, the exact vocal track feature estimator, and trying to shoot that back into the GAN. And it's still that, you know, GANs, they don't exactly know why they converge to something, but it's still not pulling in learning the vocal track feature information.
Yeah, both of the questions, and I think you guys also mentioned it, interestingly, the speaker, one of the authors of this paper actually visited UCLA a few months ago, and he actually gave a talk for this one. I don't know how many of you were there. But generally, there is this problem of kind of back and forth between the attacker and the defender. And whenever you're using something like this, that you kind of find some features, you discriminate on those features, and then you're trying to defend, there's always this problem of what if the attacker actually used some other features that's resistant. The authors argue that, it's not successful, but at least in history has been shown time and time again that it is successful. So what is really happening at the end of the day is that you have to kind of tie this into some unsolvable problem or physics phenomenon. Okay, similar to the way that we kind of show it for cryptography. In order to show that your method is absolutely, correct, it's not can be broken, is when you actually reduce it to some physical phenomena and show that, okay, that is not happening, right? So, for example, I don't know, if you can't solve this, you can be faster than the speed of the light. Or if you solve this, your speed for transmission should be bigger than this. Or it requires this amount of computational complexity that for current computers is not feasible. So usually, if you tie your solution into one of those things, that's where you kind of have a stable solution. But these kind of solutions usually going to be broken after a few years. Just it needs a more sophisticated, adversary attacks. For this particular one, I'm not saying that they didn't do a good job. They did a really good job in developing this as kind of the first method. What I'm saying is that it's most likely going to be broken very soon, because you always fundamentally kind of limited because you're just waiting for a better adversary to come, and that's what's going to happen. Any other questions? All right, thank you guys. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
This is a bit of a weird question. I was thinking if, for example, in the training of the GAN, you also supply the PCA of the organic deepfakes, then they will also learn to match the PCA. Are you aware if there has been any work done in this?
So you're providing more information to your GAN, not only just the raw signals, but also the PCA of different features and then trainings.
Yes, so that it tries to match also the PCA of the organic speeds. So then it should be undetectable.
Could be more information. If you provide more information to adversary, can technically improve your attack scenario. It may not. You have to try. And it also depends on how much information really is there that is not already, because sometimes it's just extra information you're providing is redundant because it's already in the original signal. So you have to really try to see. But as far as I know, these guys didn't try it.
They didn't try that, yeah.
But good observation. All right, thank you guys. So the third group is the fourth person is in or no?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Yeah, for the essays, I think you guys can kind of spread around, and whoever presenting is kind of being this side is better because the microphone is here. So 2 of you go on that side, 2 of you go inside, and you can read it. And then another thing is, please don't read it from your notes or cell phones. Try to memorize everything, okay? Because yeah, it's more interactive and more engaging. And so yeah, sorry if you have to know.
Okay, if I keep a timer up for us?
Yes.
Thank you.
Can you join that Zoom link?
Yes.
Well, that's okay. For you guys, it was fine. It was good presentation. I'm not gonna deduct points, but from now on, try not to read it from any notes. Try to memorize everything you have to do. Usually the trick is memorizing the first few sentences for each, slide that you want to present. Once you memorize that, then the rest you can kind of improvise, okay? And then if there are numbers that you kind of need to know, put it in the slides, okay? So like, if there are things that you really need to remember, put it in the slides. Once you look at it, that will be your cheat sheet because you can use it as well. All right, so it's kind of like the trick that you can use in order to kind of memorize what you want. All right, go ahead.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the third paper from this week, which is light commands, laser-based audio injection attacks on voice controllable systems.
Can you introduce yourself and say, oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so my name is Kieran. I'm a second year computer science student.
My name is Mithil. I'm a second year CS student as well.
I'm Nishan. I'm a third year data theory student.
I'm Nathan. I'm a third year computer science major.
Undergrad.
We're all undergrads, yeah. So we can just start out quickly with the problem that this paper is addressing, which is looking at a specific type of microphone called MEMS microphones, and how MEMS microphones, while normal microphones, you'd expect them to only accept acoustic signals. This paper evaluates and investigates that microphones can actually capture both acoustic and light signals and the problems that we can face there. So the idea here then is if these microphones can take in light, attackers can use laser injection to manipulate VC systems. And I'll go into what those are, but essentially these are systems that use these microphones in our everyday lives. And finally, these VC systems often lack user authentication mechanisms. So if an attacker was to use light injection here to manipulate the system, we have no way of verifying whether it's the correct user or an attacker. So first, we'll go in a little more in depth on actually what are these systems and how are these microphones employed here. So this is basically kind of like the process of what a VC system looks like. So VC systems, voice controllable systems, are what we use in our everyday lives, like Amazon Alexa, Google Homes, any service, even Siri on your phone. When you ask it a command, it will respond either with an action or an informed response. So how these systems normally work is it takes in a voice command, then through the microphone, it'll process that input. Inside the system will be coded to process that signal. It'll recognize your speech, and then it'll actually do an execution of that command. However, using a laser, an attacker could use light injection to give the microphone the same signal that it would receive with an audio. And then the following would then do the same process, microphone input, signal process, speech recognition, and then command execution. So this really opens up avenues for attackers to manipulate systems and really then have these Google Homes or Amazon Alexas do things like in your house. It could open a door for you, or it could, make a purchase for you. And an attacker could do this from a distance away using a laser. So that's kind of the idea here, is that using in the structure of the MEMS microphone, the hardware here can accept light signals, and then in reverse, it can actually execute commands instead of taking in an audio response.
Okay, so next I just want to talk a little bit about how exactly light can be actually perceived by sound when we're looking at these microphones specifically in on smart speakers, which is kind of the main focus of this paper. So first, the main thing we need to look at is we have these two different effects that are kind of causing this to work. So the main thing to look at is first we have the photoacoustic effect. And so the photoacoustic effect is if we were able to kind of have a laser against this part of the pressure where we have the back plate right there. And so what happens is the laser is actually focused on this part, and as it hits a part called the diaphragm. And so through that, when the laser hits that part, it starts to heat and cool in a wave type of function. And that type of function is what actually creates a sound wave that is outputted into a voltage signal that can be perceived as sound. And we have a similar type of effect on the other side called the photoelectric effect. And this, instead of hitting what's called the diaphragm, it hits what's called an ASIC. And so in this, it does a similar effect where it hits this piece and it is able to convert that wave into a voltage output, which in turn creates a sound wave. So moving on, we just have another overview of what exactly this signal injection looks like. So we have a PC and we're getting the audio signal from that laptop. And that goes through a current laser current driver. And this is what's kind of allowing us to output a current signal through that original laser output. And so once we have that audio signal and it's converted into a current with a DC bias, we are able to see that we are able to create that sound wave. So in the center of this picture, you can see exactly what this setup looks like. We have a laser with that is shining directly into the microphone. And then these right here are the two outputs. So on the top, we have the output of the current, and you can see that it kind of mimics that same function with the voltage that is outputted by the microphone. So kind of highlighting that the power is proportional to the current, and so that's why we have these two very similar looking waves on the right here. And so this is kind of a basic overview again of exactly how this attack works. So for example, if I say, okay, Google, can you open this garage door? It goes through the laptop audio and then again goes through that current laser current driver. That's what allows us to output the voltage. And then the most important part is we need to have direct line of sight into our Google Home, for example. And so if we were able to shine that laser into the microphone, we are able to pretty much open a garage door just by shining that laser into the microphone. And so that's converted into a light signal at the end.
Awesome. So now you guys have the background. How did the researchers actually go about conducting the experiment for this? So there's actually two questions that were asked. And the first one is, what is the minimum optical power required for a voice-controlled system to recognize commands? So obviously you can think that like a laser pointer that you'd buy at a store probably doesn't have as much optical power as one of the more high-profiled ones that could reach the sky if you shine it up. So they're trying to understand, what is the range of this? And they actually tested it on 17 devices. This is what that system looks like. And you can tell it's very small and it's very controlled. This is because precision is really important. So you have that laser, and that is what ranges in optical power. And then you have a mirror. And the mirror is very precise and it reflects that laser into the same part of the target, so the actual voice controlled system every time. So this is the first experiment. We'll get to the results in a bit. The second one here is basically measuring the maximum range. So how far can you be? This is probably more pertinent to an attacker because if you have to be in the vicinity or right next to it, it's probably not as useful. But if you can be, 100 meters away, that's probably something that needs to be patched immediately. So this is what that system looks like. A lens is added here in this first picture, and it's just to reduce the beam area, which makes it more precise. But you have a laser, and the second picture is actually a 100-meter hallway. And it's tested to see if 100 meters it can hit the system. And then the second part of this experiment is also a more powerful laser that's 50 meters away. So here's the results. And you can see that almost all of these devices, or actually all of these devices, were susceptible to this vulnerability at some distance. The ones in red were a 5 milliwatt laser at 110 meters. So you can see like the Echo Dot, that's like a laser you can buy at the store, and you can like use it to inject commands into these systems. Some of the other ones were at 50 meters needed 60 milliwatts. So those are way more powerful, probably something you don't really run into all the time. And then overall, they found that iPads, iPhones, and more of the handheld devices were less susceptible to this in general.
Yeah, so now to just kind of summarize the whole studies and the two parts of the experiment and some of the contributions that they outline and some of the ramifications on future results and future studies. So obviously first, they discovered the MEMS microphone vulnerabilities with the two sides, the ASIC and the diaphragm, and how when a concentrated, very accurate laser signal is put in those two things, a photoelectric effect and a photoacoustic effect ensues, which causes these negative consequences. And it also characterized the VC system vulnerabilities with various distances, which Nitin talked about, with 50 meters, 110 meters, and 30 centimeters as well. And also varying laser powers from 0.5 milliwatts to 60 milliwatts. It was a very comprehensive study with many different devices tested that we use in everyday life. And then it also acknowledged the minimal cheap equipment needed to actually conduct this attack. So unlike other laser attacks, with 5 milliwatts, you can just buy a device on Amazon and actually conduct this attack. So it kind of brought awareness to this, and a lot of future firmware updates and future physical updates as well to a lot of these devices were employed by Amazon and a lot of other players that a lot of these smart home manufacturers deal with. And last but not least, there was some software and hardware countermeasures that they provided at the end to kind of provide future work some sort of guidance to how to counteract these laser injection effects. So which I now. Yeah, so some countermeasures include actually using a physical barrier known as an opaque resin to cover the ASIC of the MEMS microphone, which is what they said counteract that photoacoustic effect or photoelectric effect. But that also has some limitations as well, because many different lights could be shined at different parts of the microphone to counteract that. So there they provided a sensor fusion technique, which is where you compare signals from multiple sensors. So just make sure that the signal that's injected is not a laser injection and not a light injection, but rather a sound wave, which is what is the desired input. And last but not least, they used a silicon plate or movable shutter to actually block the photoacoustic effect to prevent the diaphragm from wavering, which is what Jasvir talks about, so that there's no unforeseen circumstances that way.
That's all. Thank you very much.
Does the opaque lens actually works most of the time? Did they what are the scenarios that doesn't work?
Yeah, so they said that they can use the opaque to cover the ASIC, so specifically for the photoelectric effect, but they never actually tested it themselves. So they actually said that they wanted future work to do.
Oh,
but they said that the physical capabilities are a significant part of why this works.
Okay. Question.
Yeah, great job. I'm curious, does the ambient light matter at all? What if it's really bright or super dark? Does that affect the effectiveness of the attack or not?
Yeah, so one of the main reasons why this works so well is because of these two main parts of the actual microphone. It's concentrated at those two places. So there was an actual, future work thing where if you increase the power drastically, it becomes more viable to just shine it so that you don't have to be super accurate. But ambient light has to be at a really, really high power for it to work properly.
But what if there is an ambient, whether the laser actually works better or worse? For example, if this is a really dark room, I'm guessing that the less environment probably helps the laser a little bit.
Yeah, when they did their test, I'm pretty sure it was in a darker environment, so that's why they were able to see more success.
Sure.
I'm not exactly sure if they tested it with different ambient lights, but I would assume based off of the way the effect works, that if there was more light in the room, then it may not work necessarily as well because it's just accepting more light.
Yeah. But also the ASIC is a different, it's accepting probably infrared and not necessarily a visible light. So that could be something as well. Yeah, question.
Do they test it just direct line of sight with no glass or anything? Because if I was thinking an actual attack scenario, there'd probably a glass window and then the smart home would be next to it. But does the laser work shining through a pane of glass, or does the diffraction and interference cause the beam to be smudged?
So they still did test it with, they actually did test it from across the street through a building through windows, and it still worked. They did say that, with refraction, you have to be wary, but if the attacker has a good direct line of sight, even if it's through a window, it still can work.
Yeah, I have no basis of how powerful lasers are. What is a 5 milliwatt laser? What is a 60 milliwatt laser? You know what I mean? Is there any compare? Can I guess how accessible is this attack?
Yeah, 5 milliwatt laser is a laser pointer that a presenter would have. So it's what they used to shine on. So it's very, very common. You think of pens that have lasers on it. It's the back of a pen.
Okay.
Like that.
So it's possible even with very off the shelf lasers.
Yeah. To be honest, the question is more how paranoid should I be?
I would say this really opened my eyes just in general, because like I didn't know that it was even possible for a microphone to take in like a light input. So yeah, it is kind of scary in the sense of like, I think the parameters have to be right. Like the person has to have a direct line of sight through a window from a certain distance into your like Google Home or Alexa. But if it's set up properly, like they could make purchases with the light through your like Amazon Alexa, or they could even like open doors to your house just using a laser, like open your garage. So it is dangerous in a way, and it definitely is something like worth looking into. But on the other hand, like yeah, if you just have a blind over your window, then they probably won't be able to do it. So there's easy ways to counteract it, but it still is kind of dangerous.
Close your windows. That's but I mean, I think at the end of this class, everybody gonna just sell all their electronics and. Any other questions? All right, guys. Thank you so much. That was great. All right, let's have a quick break and then we come back and then we can continue.
Thank
All right, let's continue. So thanks for great presentations. This is exactly what I was looking for. So hope you guys also enjoyed it and learned from it. As for the exams and so on, as I said, the presentation is part of the lecture, so it's part of your exam. So whatever these guys said, you should expect to see some relevant questions. Of course, the questions would be more at the high level. So basically whether or not you have listened to the presentation. So we won't ask like very detailed, theoretical questions about these papers. You just assume that whether you have heard and know about this concept. Okay, yeah. Their slides, yes. We actually, I'm going to send a link for a folder that you have to upload your slides there. And please do that as soon as possible. And yeah, so you can actually, and then this recordings also will be available, so you can watch the recordings. All right. And other than that, I think in terms of content, it was great. All the three presentations. I also like the kind of the distribution of each person that was talking about like various different parts of it. The only thing is probably you want to, memorize everything and make sure not reading it from some script. But other than that, it was great. I like the memes. Make it coming, make it more. And yeah, that's it about the presentations. So let's continue about, the discussion that we had last time, and that was false. And the presentations now should give you a very good picture of sensor security at various different points. I talked about, different ones in the class, and now you've seen a more detailed one. So something to think about sensor security. And then you also seen faults as another example of that kind of thing. So we talked about, there's a stage for the fault, and we have the participation. The participation today is pacemaker. We good? All right. So we talked about, sensors, and if somebody intentionally tried to kind of put something, this is the participation. But there is also another way of attacking the system that is not necessarily the attacker tries to kind of change the environment, but tries to interact seemingly normally with the device, but tries to, exploit some other characteristics of the system. And we talked about that, and we said that essentially this is when the attacker managed to run some malicious software in your system, right? How do we do that?
we usually either use some form of human errors or some bugs in the design or just some fundamental flaws in the system, and force the device to kind of run and execute that malicious software, and as a result, the system will be compromised in various different ways. And then we also said that not necessarily you need to download a file in order to your system to be compromised. Some of these attacks can be actually fileless, and we're going to talk about that in this lecture. So we started discussion on malware. We talked about regular malwares, where these files are coming from. I think some of us also shared our stories when our systems kind of like infected with malware. There are a whole bunch of group of different malwares. We covered lots of them last time, quickly overviewing them. There was viruses and worms and Trojans and ransomwares. These are the ones that we talked about already. We said that generally, as you've seen, the difference between malwares are kind of the way that they kind of infiltrate your system, the way that kind of spread themselves, and the attack or the goal that they're trying to achieve. All of them at the end of the day trying to hurt the system, but it's just some of them are designed with different goals. Viruses was the most famous one. It's kind of part of a regular software, gets into your system when you're running or downloading or installing a regular software. The worms are those that tries to be spreading themselves, and they have to kind of be host independent so that they can actually be as flexible as possible. Worms usually kind of at first steps of a more generic attack that you want to launch. Trojans also the same idea. It comes as seemingly innocuous and benign looking applications, but with some trigger they become activated and start doing something malicious. Trojans, particularly for hardware, is very, really important. We're going to revisit hardware Trojans later down in the course. Then we talked about ransomwares as the most prevalent type of malware these days, because it can actually go through the memory, encrypt everything, ask for money or ransom, and then it can actually decrypt your system. So essentially your system is not impacted if you pay. So there's kind of incentive for both the attackers and the defenders to kind of like play in this game, which is kind of win-win in some cases if you want to think about. And ransomwares could be usually the last end of a sophisticated attack chain where a virus or a worm infected the system, make it ready for a ransomware to be installed. The ransomware installed, do the actual attack, and then that's where the whole system or the whole attack is successful. WannaCry, if those of you who have read about WannaCry, if you didn't, definitely go and take a look at WannaCry as one of the first ransomwares. But the examples of ransomware is actually very, very common these days. LAUSC, I think he actually was impacted recently, so on and so forth. So there was lots of. All right. So apart from those, there are a whole bunch of others that I want to quickly go over. There's bots or botnets. So botnets are essentially this piece of software that crawls through the internet to kind of find a device that is vulnerable, to hack a device, to kind of take control of the device in some sense. Okay. And the goal of these bots or botnets is to create an army of botnets, such that they can actually be synchronized and do something malicious altogether. What do? They usually are used for what we call a distributed denial of service attacks, or DDoS. The DDoS example, the most famous example, the Mirai botnets that happens in 2016, which targeted lots of high-profile websites, including many banks, things like Facebook and Amazon and Netflix and so on. And actually, there are lots of reports of millions and billions of dollars that combined these companies have lost because their websites were down. So the way it works is that the bots is this piece of program. For example, this Mirai was this piece of program that scans through the internet, trying to find the devices that had very weak password and authentication mechanism. So for example, they found that many devices either don't have any password, or they have very default password, like admin, or admin default, things like that. And they found that they can actually take control of many of these devices if they can crawl and search the internet correctly. So they, for example, found that your smart toaster or smart door lock and things like that are actually connected to the internet, and they can process something, although very small and very limited. They take control of this, and they take control of thousands of this, and not just one or two, but thousands of this together. And what they did is that they all together send a request to a particular web server. All right. So think about it as like the time that you want to buy a ticket for a particular concert and the website is down. Exact same thing kind of happening here, but it's more massive scale and more directed to particular websites. So they actually managed to bring the website down because it was flooded with all these requests they cannot handle, crash the website, the web server, and as a result, the website goes out of service for some time. And that's a big issue for many of these companies. Okay, so yeah.
Does having the captcha solve the data?
Say it again.
Does having a captcha replacement?
I think the captcha can help. Yes, that's one thing that many companies do. But this is more as the just even before that, even sending the request to this web servers. There might be some handshaking that can help in order to help you to not even accept the request. But even the first step is in like, I'm sending a request, I need to process what this even request is. That's kind of like the main reason that the systems are gonna crash. But yeah, any sort of helps on the network side, it will help you with this. We're not gonna unfortunately go through the network security layer, but that could help, yes. All right, so that's kind of the idea of botnets. Botnets not necessarily could be used for only DDoS attacks, could be used for many other things as well. For example, sending messages or sending phishing emails and things like that, creating fake news. All these things could be used with an army of controlled bots. Okay, so that's another reason that you may want to create a malware. Then we have adware and malvertising. These are the two kind of relevant concepts. Adware is actually a piece of malware that forms as an advertisement. Okay, it's like you won and then you download, and this is actually a malware. They could be for tracking or spying, so you may not be actually do something with your computer, but it could be just installing some form of tracking. Or it could be just for annoyance, right? So, and this kind of ads could be there. So adware is just malware. Malvertising is a way for infecting your computers. Okay. Sorry. My example of U1 was actually malvertising, was an adware. Adware is just an ad that is actually a malware. Okay. But malvertising is like, tricking you to download some file or doing something. So the ad itself is just an ad, but the ad is kind of linked to some file that is actually a malware. Okay, so that's kind of the difference between the two. Yeah, so I mean, any of these emails that you receive that you want something and click here or click there, this is kind of like, form of malvertising. Because once you click, then probably they launch and other things, and that would result in a malicious file. All right. I think finally it's the spyware, which the goal is specifically spying. Again, it's really you may say that spyware is just another form of regular malware. For example, the very famous one, a very popular one, is keylogging. The idea here is that there will be this piece of software that's going to be installed in your system, and then whenever you're typing any key, that will be recorded and that will be transmitted to another device. Okay, and that's very important for many devices. This keylogging could be even at the hardware level. So for example, there are attacks and instances that somebody like puts something in your keyboard, or like added a small dongle to your computer, things like that, that they manage to actually log your activity. So spyware is actually one of the special types of malware that's particularly it's just trying to collect information, doesn't do anything malicious in a sense. It's just collecting information. As a result, it's really hard to detect spyware compared to the others because it's not really running anything other than just collecting your information. Rootkit is also another special type of malware. It's part of two things, the root and the kit. Really what it does is trying to get root level privileges. Remember I told you about, principle of least privilege, the fact that there is different, domains of user and root. So rootkit is one of those malware that what it does, what it tries to do is kind of like trying to overcome that isolation boundary between the user and the root. Once the adversary can get access to the root level, privileges, then they can run much more sophisticated attack. Okay, so rootkit is kind of like, again, similar to worms, is the first steps of a more sophisticated attack, where they're trying to kind of like, get root level accesses one way or another. If you're interested, take a look at the examples that I'm providing. And finally, there is a whole class of what we call fileless attacks, which what it does is not really injecting anything to your system. It's actually reusing some form of vulnerability that exists in your system in order to attack the system. And I'm going to talk about this in the next few slides of how do we actually do that. Okay, so that's kind of it for your malware design. Let me go back into this picture here. So we talked about viruses and worms and Trojans, ransomwares and botnets, and the adware and malvertising, spyware, rootkits, and fileless malwares. Okay. Any questions from any of these type of malwares? Okay. All right, so there are various methods, and as I said, each one is basically trying to spread themselves differently and trying to achieve a goal similar to other, problems in cybersecurity. Unfortunately, malware also is on the rise. So you might also wonder how to create malware, just for fun of it. But we probably want to know more about how to defend, against malware. Defense against malware is also, in order to understand how to defend, you probably also will learn how to create. And that's why, people are actually, actively investigating how to create new malwares, not just for creating a malware, but how we can defend against it. So similar to the previous cases, you will also have two options: the prevention and detection for malware. For prevention, we can have a variety of different solutions. We can use software or memory protection mechanisms so that the malware cannot be installed. We can use best practices in order to avoid the malware from happening. This is all this, training that we have for our employees, for our students. We can also have new network protections and firewalls in order to kind of detach and isolate our network from the rest of the world. So things like DDoS, for example, cannot happen. Things like phishing email and malvertising cannot happen. So a collection of things that we can do at the software level, but mostly using practices and infrastructure in order to prevent us from malware is really the only way that we can prevent from malwares to happen. Okay. On the detection side, we have two options. We have static analysis, which essentially what it does is that scan through your memory or your network, wherever the malware is installed, and trying to find some patterns, some signatures. Okay. We usually call this signature-based kind of detection as well. What it does is trying to find some known patterns, and these patterns are the known malware. So for example, I know a big list of all the malwares. I know how they look like. What I'm going to do is that I'm going to go through your memory and see whether you are already infected with any of these malwares. Okay. The second one is what we call a dynamic analysis, which we usually call it anomaly detection, which means that I don't have any idea of how a malware would look like. What I do know is that what my normal behavior should look like. Okay, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to do an anomaly detection, which means that I'm going to basically create this baseline system, and then if there is any sort of deviation from this, I'm going to detect that as an anomaly. right? So for example, for ransomware, the idea would be that I should not see a program in my computer going through my memory and tries to, use encryption. So if I see something that is like, calling an encryption function over and over and over again, this is an indication that probably something going on in terms of a ransomware. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to monitor, for example, the memory reads, or I'm going to monitor the requests for AES encryption and things like that. And if I see a significant surge, I'm going to say that, okay, this is a potential possibility or potential type of attacks that I need to detect. All right. So to give you a little bit more background on anomaly detection, we typically, start with some program features. Okay, as in what I'm really trying to monitor. For example, am I reading function calls? Am I going a little bit down and looking at the powers or performance counters? What exactly am I using as my features? The features could be software, could be hardware, could be systems, could be combination. Then what I need to do is building what we call a reference model. Essentially, the idea here is that now I need to know what my normal program would look like using these features. So I'm going to run a bunch of normal programs, collect these features, and build what we call a reference model. Then I need to dynamically monitor the system. So this first part is kind of, you can call it as a training phase, which you kind of build your baseline model, your golden model. Now you kind of need to, okay, I'm going to, from now on, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to constantly monitor the system. And whenever I see a big deviation using some metric, this metric could be something like a statistical metric, could be simple as, some image processing metric, could be a time domain metric, could be anything. Essentially, when I see a big deviation between what I would expect to see versus what is really happening, if there is a big difference between these two, then I'm going to raise the flag and say, okay, this is probably a potential. Okay. So there are many important questions like what features to use, what model to use, how to monitor dynamically, what sort of granularity of monitoring do we need, what exactly are we comparing, what sort of metrics should we use, and then what should we do even when we are detecting the malware. So all these questions are very important and valid questions. And then to answer this is really depends on your setup. Okay, so is your malware detector, for example, is a hardware malware detector or it's a software malware detector? What features are you exactly looking? What sort of applications do you have and all those things? In your paper readings, actually, you have a few examples, and we're going to talk about it next week about one or two of these malware detector and malwares. So you're going to learn a little bit about these questions under one particular circumstances. But if you actually go through malware detectors, both software and hardware, you will see that there's plenty of these different ones. Each one kind of make different decisions, use different metrics. One that is very common these days is machine learning based malware detectors, which kind of use some form of features to extract and then use some form of machine learning or deep learning in order to detect. Okay. Yeah, so I'm just going through a list of different things. For example, features to use, you can use RFs, you can do network activities, you can use software instruction level, or you can even go lower to hardware, looking at things like cache, branch misprediction, etc. You can use signal processing or machine learning or hybrid or deep learning for your model. Coverage is the big question that you need to kind of you need to answer. And of course, anything that you do for your malware detection, there is an overhead with it because you're going to implement this in piece of hardware. You're going to put it next to the original system. So you have to think about that. You cannot really have a giant malware detector for a very small processor, right? So it has to be a balance between what you're protecting versus what you're actually using. So you have to keep that in mind as well. Again, for the comparison, you can use different metrics, statistical tests, thresholding, machine learning. And one of the big problems in malware detection and generally anomaly detection is the trade-off between false positives and true positives. What is really happening is that if you're really aggressive in detecting malware, your true positive goes up, which means that you can detect all the malwares that you want. But on the other hand, your false positive also goes up, which means that you're also labeling correct examples, correct executions as malware, because you're essentially very, very sensitive to kind of detecting malware. Okay, but on the other hand, if you're not caring about your false positive, if you're caring about your false positive, you don't really want your system to mislabel things, you can be very less aggressive, and then you kind of let things go, and then in that case your false positive really goes down. But on the other hand, unfortunately, your true positive also goes down, right? So what you ideally want to have is really high true positive and very, very low false positive, and that's where all these ideas about what sort of metric should I use, what sort of features should I use, and all those things comes into the play. Okay, and then the fact that whether I want more true positive or whether I want less true false positives also depends on the application scenario. So probably if this is used as first line of defense, then you may not care much about false positive because someone else is going to check it later. But if this is kind of like your last line of defense, then you probably want to have really, really low false positives. If this is an application in military systems, you probably want to have really high true positive. But if this is more a consumer grade, you probably want to have lower false positive. So this kind of trade-off depending on the application actually matters a lot. All right. And then finally, what happens when we are detecting the anomaly? You can do multiple different things. Usually you report it to a higher hierarchy. Okay, so if this is hardware, you report it to the system. If it's a system, you may report it to the user. If there's multiple, systems within the network, you may report it to the next part of your network, and so on and so forth. Usually, anomaly detection happens in layers, as in like you have a hardware malware detector, network malware detector, software malware detector, and so on and so forth. And as I said, you can be conservative and you can be aggressive, right? You may decide not to report anything and be very conservative. You may be very aggressive, and as soon as you detect something, you may want to report it. So that's kind of also the games that as a security engineer, you may want to think about. Okay. Another big challenge in anomaly detection and malware is that whatever method we use, there is always an adversary that might adapt. We actually had this discussion about detecting, for example, fake voices and so on. So the same story can happen for malware. If I'm using some features and I build a discriminatory system based on that, what will happen is that there might be some other features that the adversary might use next time that cannot be detected with my current system, right? We usually call that evasive malware, right? It's trying to constantly change their signatures, their patterns, so that if you're using any sort of anomaly detection, still cannot use and it cannot find us. Okay. What we do is there is a whole bunch of how to create anomaly detection for evasive malwares as well. So it's not like, we say that, oh, okay, at this point, we don't know what to do. And then, okay, there is evasive malware and we cannot do anything about it. There's actually active research on how to detect evasive malwares, how to generate evasive malwares, and so on. But at the end of the day, it's basically a cycle of I create a defense, there is a malware, I create another defense, and there is malware, and so on and so forth. Really, the effective mechanisms are those that can kind of break this cycle and show that, this is, even if the adversary tries to make the better malware, they cannot because of these fundamental reasons that we have. Okay? Any questions about malware detection? You're going to see a concrete example in your readings and presentation next week. So hopefully you get a little bit more familiar with how do we do malware detection. But it's interesting, again, area of difference between understanding the system, how to generate the malware, how to detect it, and so on and so forth.
This is kind of a general question. In your opinion, do you think it's worth buying antivirus software?
Buying antivirus software. Yes, I think it's worth it. And again, depends on the system that you're using and kind of what sort of data you have on that system. But usually, having the antiviruses are essentially the static one. They're not anomaly detectors. They're looking for patterns in your system in order to find it. So usually all these antiviruses work with this giant database of known malware. And what they do is that they constantly update this, like, within hours or within minutes. And they go through your memory and tries to see if they see a pattern that's kind of like matched with any of these known malwares that they have. And then based on that, they basically detect your systems. And they're kind of more after the fact. So my suggestion is more of using firewalls and good practices rather than using antiviruses. But for some systems, using antivirus is a good thing to do. Any other questions?
So if you're doing like anomaly detection, you would basically be using like machine learning to monitor like the control flow, right?
Not control flow, some features usually, some lower level than control flow.
So if it's lower level than control, I mean, you would get a lot of data into the machine learning algorithm, right? So it would take a long time for everything to propagate, and you would have to also have like a lot of processing power going into that.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily very ideal, is it?
It's not, depends. I mean, the classifiers these days can be lightweight. So it's not like, there's a whole bunch of processing needs to be done. You take snapshots of your system. So you don't need to constantly monitor it. You take a snapshot, read some, features. You feed it into your classifier, whatever it is. You make a decision on whether this is normal or not. And then you wait for another cycle, for another snapshot to come, and then you repeat this. Okay, so that's kind of like the idea of how you do it.
Definitely. For the static discovery, where they just check your memory against like a known list of databases.
Yes.
Does it take an incredibly long time to check your entire memory against that entire database of all?
Yes, I mean, they have clever methods of like doing it hierarchical and put it in some trees. There's a whole bunch of like how you can very quickly search it, but if you actually pay attention, in antiviruses takes hours and hours in your system to actually go through the whole scan. That's the reason, because it just needs to do lots of checks. So even in the like high-end processor, it takes hours to go through all content of your memory. The reason is exactly this. It's like just really very heavy, computationally heavy process. And then what they do is they don't need to scan everything from scratch every time. They'll probably just have some kind of checksum to see what has been modified and what has not been. If things hasn't been modified, there's no point of going through them again, right? You just check the parts that has been modified. So there are other tricks that you can do in order to reduce the number of lines that you're searching through your program. All right. So let's now talk about the type of attacks that don't necessarily use like downloading any specific file, but it actually kind of exploiting the existing problems in your system. And that's really what we call memory corruption attacks. Let's talk about the objectives, and let's talk about how we can actually do that. The goals is the same. So it's still, you want to, as an adversary, you want to hurt the system and create some harm. So confidentiality, integrity, availability, same sort of things that you want to do. Specifically for memory corruption attacks, the idea is that the attacker wants to override some part of the memory or take control or change the privileges of your system to ultimately either leak some data, to take some control, or attack your integrity of your system or availability of your system. This change could be either at the data level or at the code level or the combination. So anything that's been stored in your memory could be impacted by a memory corruption attack. Typically what happens is that during the memory corruption attacks, we do what we call hijacking the control flow, which means that, if I can write things into the main memory, what I can do is generally change the program that's currently being executed, right? Or change the pointer counter, the PC, to other part of the memory and force the system to run that part of the memory, okay? So if you're familiar with like the basics of how the computer works, is that you have your memory. Typically your memory is combination of instruction and data memory together. Sometimes it's separated, but most of the time it's the same. Your memory is usually segmented into different parts. For example, this would be your code. And the way that you're executing your program is that there is usually a pointer, which we call program counter or PC, that points to different parts of your memory, okay? And whatever it points, that's where we're going to execute the commands. For example, you have a bunch of different instructions like add and then XOR and whatever. And then the PC first points to this one, which means that the processor needs to read this, execute this, and then it's going to increment the pointer to this one, and then execute this one, and then goes to the next one, and next one, and next. Okay, so really the way that we are executing a program, the way that we know where we are in the program is based on this PC. If I change the PC, I'm running a different program. Okay, so running a different program in a computer is as simple as just changing the PC. I don't even need to change the memory. I just need to change the PC to point it to somewhere else in the program. Okay, so what changing this memory attacks could do is that I can change this PC or indirectly change the PC, as I'm going to describe how it works, which that, when I'm changing this, I'm going to force the system to run a different sequence of instructions. Okay, we usually call this hijacking the control flow. The control flow means that every program has a bunch of different basic blocks. As for example, you do this, then there's some form of an if then else or some form of a branch. Then you either do this or that, and then you continue, right? All your programs have something like this. And what you want to do as an attacker is hijacking this flow of, okay, in normal way, I would run this one and then this one and then this one. Maybe I want to run completely different things. Okay, so maybe I want to, when you're, running your, checking your emails, maybe I want to completely hijack this and open a terminal, right? So that's kind of the idea that when we are talking about control flow, that's what we're going to get. So let's see how we actually how do we hijack the control flow? And then the second question is that if the adversary managed to hijack the control flow, what would happen then? What is the goal of the adversary? Okay, I'm disrupting the original execution, but then what? Okay, so in order to answer that, let's take a step back. And let's see what we're talking about here. So what we are saying here is that instead of manipulating the sensors or the environment, you are normally interacting with the computer. And what you're doing is, instead of trying to kind of like, send an incorrect input, you're forcing the system to kind of operate in a different manner. How do I do that? I'm trying to change the control flow, force the system to run different codes and programs than what they're supposed to do. Okay, so that's really what we're trying to achieve here. So what do we do when we are hijacking the control flow? The hijacking the control flow is usually, accompanied by what we call executing a payload. This is the part that's actually do the damage and do the attack. So essentially, the idea is that I'm hijacking and then I'm adding the payload. And together, this would be the attack that the adversary tries to do. Okay. What is the payload? The payload could be any suspicious or any malicious activity. Could be any of those malwares that we talked about. Remember, I told you that you might download some file that is malicious, but how do you actually execute them? You can execute them this way. All right. So if you know where they are stored in your program memory, then you can point the execution to that point and say, okay, go and execute that. But there's actually a more sophisticated things to do. Remember, we want to talk about fileless attacks, where you don't have the payload necessarily downloaded into your system. You can actually create your own payload as well. I'm going to talk about that as well. But generally, I'm hijacking the control flow. Now I can do whatever I want. Now I'm going to run some payload to attack this system. Okay. So what is the payload? What is the definition? Usually the definition is like, piece of program that achieves something malicious. We usually call this actually a malware. And as I said, there is a difference between fileless and regular malware. So the payload, as I said, could be installed using the method that I described before, all these different malwares, but it could be also not installed and could be within your program memory itself. That's what I'm going to describe now to you as well. All right. So again, we are interacting with the system, we're corrupting the memory. Once it's corrupted, the values will be overwritten and control flow will be hijacked. Once the control flow is hijacked, then that's where we're going to run the payload. So we need to kind of redirect the memory to somewhere that my payload is. And then afterwards, the payload is going to be executed and boom, the attack is successful. All right. So let's talk about how do we actually hijack the control flow. And then I'm going to talk about different ways of doing the payload. Okay. What sort of payloads are we looking at? And what sort of payloads has been attacked and has been used so far. So very quickly, we don't have much time, so I'm going to just talk about the basics and then we're going to talk about it next time. So this is actually very, very old problem. It's one of the very first software security problems. It's usually created by bugs. The reason that I can actually corrupt the memory is because of the bugs. And then it's really, really hard to remove because generally you want your memory to be there. There are lots of legacy software that has this bugs, and in order to kind of completely eliminate this, you need to go and get rid of all those legacy software, which is not easy to do. But there are, like, for example, new programming languages such as Rust or WASM and so on that they're actually robust against this memory corruption attacks. So that's why you may want to kind of switch to that kind of programming languages. But also defenses against memory corruption has this big trade-off between performance and security, as I'm going to talk about. All right. So let's actually talk about the very famous type of memory corruptions. There are a whole bunch of them, but the one that I'm going to talk about is buffer overflow. So as you know, your memory, as I said, it's laid out into these different sections. You have like a text section, data section. But the biggest parts, the most important parts that is actually causing this is this kind of growing area, this dynamic area that is comprised of your heap and your stack. Usually they're growing into the opposite direction. So the heap can go upwards and the stack can go downwards. In some systems, the stack goes upward and the heap goes downwards. That doesn't matter. In both cases, the buffer overflow might be successful. But what's really happening is that there are ways that you can actually play with this, and the adversary will use that in order to attack it. So let's see how. And this is basically the memory layout per process. Each process is going to have a separate memory layout like this. If you guys are familiar with virtualization, that's where the idea of virtualization comes into play. But for now, just don't worry about that. Let's say we have a process P1, and this is the memory layout for that process. This process has this bug that the adversary is going to use in order to launch a control flow hijacking attacks. Okay, let's see how. In order to understand how this works, you need to know what we call a calling convention. So a calling convention is that whenever you have a function call and function returns, you have to follow a specific set of guidelines. If your program is flat, which means that there is no call or there's no return, then obviously you're not vulnerable, particularly for this type of attacks. But in almost all programs that we write, there is some calls and there's some returns. And unfortunately, that makes us vulnerable to these attacks. Why? So essentially for calling, there's this, as I said, there's this set of mechanisms that we need to do to follow the calling convention. So for example, if you have, let's say, a function called main, you have a bunch of different instructions, and at some point you have something, let's say, call, and then you have a bunch of different instructions. And then let's say call foo. This is a function that I'm going to call. So somewhere else in the memory, I'm going to have a bunch of different things and then a return. All right. So what is happening really in terms of the actual execution of this is that your PC is going to start, for example, from here. All right. So this is where your PC going to point. The PC going to run things one by one until it reaches to this call. Okay, and that's where we are saying that this is a calling convention. That's actually we need to follow some set of rules that I'm going to describe in the next slide. But what's really happening to PC is that if, for example, PC, let's say this PC is equal to 100, so PC is equal to 100 at the point. And then this foo maybe stores at like 500. I'm just making up numbers, all right? So what's really happening at this point is that when I'm executing this call, it's really what is happening is that my PC becomes equal to 500, okay? So when my PC becomes equal to 500, instead of executing this, the next instruction I'm going to execute will be this, all right? And afterwards, I'm going to add PC by 1. So I'm going to execute these instructions. Once I reach to this return instruction, and what this return instruction is going to do is that it's going to change back to PC plus 1 of whatever this address was. So we will, we will save this address, okay, before jumping. And once I reach to this, I'm going to add PC to 100 plus 1, which is going to be this instruction here. All right. So this is kind of like the idea of how we do the call and return. Essentially, we just manipulate the PC, and that's all we did. All right. Everything else is already stored in my program memory. Okay. So when I reach here, I'm kind of jumping into here, start executing this. When I reach to the return, I'm going to just jump back into this. All right. So that's the normal execution. Whenever I'm doing the call, not only I just change the PC, but I also follow some other rules. For example, the callee going to promise that they're going to leave some registers unchanged for the caller. For example, if things needs to be modified for those registers, they have to kind of save it and then retrieve it later on. Because remember, for example, when I'm this main function versus when I'm here, there are some registers that I'm going to use here, right? And when I'm jumping here, those registers, you can think about it that they are reset because you're in this different function. So those values that you have there no longer are valid here. So you have to kind of either assume that those values are saved, or if you want to change them, you have to save them and recover them if you want to, right? So your registers has to be saved. Your pointers have to be saved. For example, there's a stack pointer, there's a frame pointer, there's a bunch of different pointers that you may want to keep track of. So you need to save those as well because you're changing your frame from one function to another function. And the most important thing is that you save the return address, because whenever you're jumping from one function to another function, you also need to remember where you jumped from, all right? If you don't remember, then whenever you reach the end of this function, you are lost. You don't know where to jump back to, right? So you have to also save that return address, and that's the most important part of this calling convention. All right. So combination of these. So these are a little bit more details about this. I'm going to skip this for now. But the caller and callee are going to do different things. They're going to save stuff and so on and so forth. But this would be how your kind of stack would look like. There will be like old stuff. There will be some parameters for this new function. There will be the return address, there will be the base pointer, and then these are all the local variables for the new function. So this is the old function, this is the new function. So this is our main, and this is our foo, okay? And remember, our stack just kind of goes downward, okay? It just goes downward, all right? So this is kind of like where we have for when we are calling a function. If you want the details, just take a look at these details here, all right? So what's happening now? The last thing that I want to discuss today is that can I actually override this stack by just writing things into my own parts, into my own local parts? How do I do that? That's the trick that I'm going to use. I'm going to actually overwrite this buffer, but instead of writing, for example, 20 bits into this buffer, I'm going to write much more into this buffer. So what's going to happen is that it's going to overwrite this. It's going to overwrite this. It can even go higher and overwrite this. But then one thing that you need to pay attention to is that by writing to this part, I'm changing this return address, okay? And what I can do is that now I can be very, very intelligent about what I'm overwriting. For example, remember I told you the address 100 and 500. Let's say that your malicious code is stored at 1000, okay? What I can do is that I can overwrite these things, and make sure that my overwriting is so engineered well that this number becomes 1000. So what will happen now? Whenever we are reaching to the return address, instead of jumping to this address that's supposed to be 100, it's now 1000. So we are actually jumping to 1000 when I'm returning the function. And that means that I'm going to, instead of jumping back to my main function and continuing my main function, whenever I reach the return here, I'm going to jump. I'm going to jump to the beginning of this malicious function. And that's how we're going to actually force the system to run this. The more details I'm going to talk about in the next lecture. All right. Thank you.